I've talked extensively about this before, but this article has some of the results of how these efforts have been going. And this is from the Marshall Project. It says, sending unarmed responders instead of police. What we've learned, there are now more than 100 response teams nationwide that send unarmed responders instead of police. And I've often mentioned how insane it is to send armed cops, send guys with guns because like the neighbor has loud music, so I need a guy with a gun to show up. Or there's a homeless guy taking a dump in the fountain out front, I need a guy with a gun to show up. It's absolute lunacy. And of course, it often ends in just horrific outcomes. In the 4 years since George Floyd's murder, many sweeping attempts to reform policing have faltered. But one proposal that has taken hold across the country and continues to spread is launching alternative first response units that send unarmed civilians instead of armed officers to some emergencies. In Dayton, Ohio, trained mediators are dispatched to neighbor disputes and trespassing calls in Los Angeles. Outreach workers who have lived through homelessness, incarceration, or addiction respond to 911 calls concerning people living on the street. In Anchorage, Alaska, trained clinicians and paramedics are showing up to mental health crises. So these are all just like no-brainers. Of course, you should not be sending cops, guys with guns to deal with, someone with mental health problems. To continue from the article, how many of these programs depends on how you define them. Some distinguish between mobile crisis teams, which exclusively send clinicians to mental health emergencies, and community responder programs, which send civilians to a wider range of calls. The key tenets are that they can be the first response to an emergency situation and that they arrive without armed officers. In Washington, D.C., the city started a program in 2021 to send mental health providers to those kind of calls. But according to a lawsuit, just 327 calls were referred to it in 2022, less than 1% of the eligible calls. They have this thing, and I lived in DC during those years, which I never even saw. I never even saw one. I saw cops everywhere, but I never saw this. They have a system where you're supposed to be able to send mental health providers rather than cops to certain calls, and they basically never did it. 1% of eligible calls. So 1% of the calls that they should have been sent on, they were actually sent. One challenge to scaling up these programs is dispatchers who are often trained to err on the side of sending police. They want to be involved in order to justify their money, in order to justify all the crazy amounts of money the U.S. pours into policing. You need those police to be doing things, even when it's not the things that guys with guns should be doing. They actually want to go out on a lot of these calls. Now, there are certain ones, if the homeless guy humping the fire hydrant, maybe they don't want to be on that one. But in general, they want to be on all these calls because it means they're doing something, they look busy. It also allows them to insert themselves into the community when they have no business being there. To continue, there have been no known major injuries of any community responder on the job so far, according to experts. No known major injuries, despite the fact that there are 100 of these programs across the country. And look, I've always said when this started becoming something that people were talking about, I've always said that eventually you do this long enough, there will come some very bizarre event where a mentally ill homeless person, stabs a mental health professional. Of course, it could happen. And eventually, you do this long enough, eventually it will happen. That is not a reason to throw out these efforts, which seem to 100% be working. I mean, if you have 100 of these campaigns across the nation, resulting in police not being called thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times, and so far, no one's even been hurt during these, and it means that, guess what? The people who have the cops called on them are also not getting hurt because guys with guns don't show up. Guys with tasers don't show up. To continue from the article, data suggests unarmed responders rarely need to call in the police for help. In Eugene, Oregon, which has operated the Crisis Assistance Help Out on the Streets response team since 1989, roughly 1% of their calls end up requiring police. Albuquerque responders have asked for police in 1% of their calls since January. In Denver, the support team assisted response had never called for police backup due to a safety issue. In Durham, members of the group there reported feeling safe on 99% of all the calls. In a survey of hundreds of residents in Portland, Oregon, where the street response team has been operating since 2021, nearly half said they did not feel safe calling 911. So this is saying that residents in many areas no longer feel safe calling the cops. because the cops are idiots that show up with guns. There are many areas where they need assistance. They need someone to come help, but they're not going to call the cops because that could end up with the person calling getting arrested. Could end up with the person calling getting shot, as we saw with the Sonia Massey. And it says the rate is even higher amongst Black and Latino residents. Instead of being dispatched through 911, programs in cities like Atlanta have opted to use a non-emergency line. That way, if a call coming from 311 is deemed better suited for police, the caller can make the decision whether to transfer to 911 or hang up. Studies suggest that eventually a large portion of current police work could be handed off to alternative responders. A 2020 review of 911 calls in 8 major cities estimates that up to 68% of calls could be handled without sending an armed officer. But of course, the police don't want that. Now, I'm not saying they are opposed to all of these programs, but they don't want 68% of calls being handed off because all of a sudden they're going to stop getting as much money. And so they're going to start finding ways to try and say that these responders should not be in their cities. Getting there will take a buy-in, a big buy-in from multiple government branches, a sizable and steady budget, and time. And now you get down to the money question. Oh, we found a way to make the world better? Well, where's the money? Oh, the money's not rolling in because it doesn't make a lot of money for people. Whereas you have something like body cameras, which is a surveillance effort of citizens and is used by the police in order to facilitate their own lies and their own propaganda. Body cameras, loads of money rolled in because there was money to be made by surveillance companies. There's limited data on how communities feel about these new programs. A survey of over 600 Durham residents found that 57% were more likely to call 911 because of the city's HEART program. That's the name of their unarmed response. Meaning 911 is the one sending many of the calls to the unarmed response unit, so they're more likely to call 911 because they know there's a way to get an unarmed response. Someone in Atlanta noted that without increasing other social services like housing and mental health care, the teams risk being merely a band-aid for people in crisis, which, yes, I totally agree with. This is not the full-on solution to the crises, the many crises going on around America, but it would decrease the amount of incidents that cops are involved in. And that is always a good thing. Always a good thing.